Yo, Boop, tell them the boxing source dealing with them. Easy, JBZ. I represent, Mr. Killer say, yo, this is the biggest and the baddest association. You don't know, once you're associated with JBZ, everything easy. You don't know, big up the boxing source. Mr. Killer representing for Landry. Bang.
Yo, what's up? What's happening? What's good? Here on the Boxing Source, wanted to get in another video in reference to the WBC featherweight champion, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. He was a few days ago on the Last Stand podcast with Brian Custer. And there was one other thing that I wanted to go over here, where Gary Russell Jr. explains a situation in reference to a topic that was brought up over the course of this year when it came to a potential fight that he could have had this year against an opponent. And y'all know who it was. It's in the title. Mr. Devin Haney, the WBC lightweight champion. We've kind of gone through this. Actually, we basically went through it while that whole situation was supposed to be going on. But I wanted to run this here with Mr. Gary Russell Jr. So let's see if we could go for it right here, right now. Let's go.
It seems like all the guys you've had beef with, we've had them on the show. Devin Haney. Recently had Devin Haney on the show. And I asked him about why he hasn't fought you. And this, I'm quoting Devin Haney. He said, Gary Russell Jr. is cat. Obviously the young folks say fake. That's the slang for fake. He just says the craziest expletive is what he used. He's not serious. He's just crazy. Your response to Devin Haney?
I mean, I don't really respond to Devin Haney for real, because the difference between me and Devin Haney is I'm a fighter. I'm a real fighter. I'm a real man. In most cases, Devin Haney let a lot of his father do a lot of his work for him. So I'm hands-on with a lot of my stuff. But as far as that Devin Haney situation goes, that was a fight we was trying to make. We was trying to make that fight before the pandemic even happened. We was trying to make that fight before the pandemic even happened, before anything came out, and they was talking about this. First of all, this bullshit-ass term sheet that they pulled out. Before anything came out, I was already on the phone with Bill Haney, with his father, talking to him about trying to make a fight between me and his son, and we could possibly make X amount of dollars. I don't know if they was just riding the media, trying to get some more popularity off the media or whatever the situation was. But I was always trying to make the fight happen.
And what was wrong with the term sheet that they sent? What was the issue?
I mean, he sent the term sheet, and the term sheet didn't have the zone or matchroom on the term sheet. Basically, he sent me a blank contract. Don't have. First of all, if we're gonna fight, I need to know what network we're gonna be competing on, and who's the promotion, who's gonna be promoting what's going on. They sent me a term sheet basically signing, here, Gary, sign this paper, and basically I'm gonna get back with you, and I'm gonna go and holler at them and see if they're gonna get on board. Nah, that's not how you do business. That's not how you do business. You don't do business that way. Not with me. So, you gotta be a little more thorough. I think with Will, and even the date that they had, a lot of people don't understand that a lot of these dates that these promoters, the date that Devin Haney put out, I think, what was the date? November something?
Yes. It will be November.
Okay, something like that. Well, a lot of these promoters, they already have their dates, or these networks already have their dates locked in for the entire year.
There you go.
They already have their dates locked in for the entire year. Devin Haney already knew that he was going to be competing on that particular date. He already was in training camp for that particular date, So don't try to jump on board and be like, well, let's fight on November 7th. That's a date that y'all already got available. I'm not in camp. We can make this fight for sure. For sure, let's make this fight happen. We need a full the full 8 weeks with camp, I spank your little ass. You know, but they was already getting ready to fight Gamble. They was already in the mix of fighting Gamble. I think it was just a media buzz. They was just trying to get some hype off the name or get some media buzz or something. I don't know. And then
he goes into that a little bit more in detail on the Last Stand podcast with Brian Custer, but what was basically said is a timeline, and I could, go through that same timeline. Like, you check things out. Gary Russell Jr. said that, there was a potential thing where they could have negotiated for that fight to happen. WBC featherweight champion moving up to 135 to face the WBC lightweight champion. Now, the thing about it is, from the initial discussion, Gary Russell Jr. gave him a figure, okay? And Bill Haney wasn't really interested in that figure, okay? Now, soon after that, you had the situation between Gary Russell Jr. and Terrence Crawford, come back up. And that's when Gary Russell Jr. was aggressive, saying that, look, I'll fight Terrence Crawford for 1.5. I don't care. I'll move up to 147 and fight you for 1.5. Let's make something shake. That's what he says, right? So, after that kind of gets kind of dismissed by Terrence Crawford, that's when Bill and Devin Haney come back and say, hey, so you wanna fight Terrence Crawford for 1.5? Why not fight me for 1.5? So Gary Russell Jr. is pretty much like, all right, cool, fight for 1.5. So when the term sheets started to come out, it was like, kind of looked like it was delayed, didn't have the details on it and stuff like that. So it looked like it was going back and forth. Then in September, first couple weeks of September, okay, basically we were talking with Gary Russell Jr. about the progress of that fight potentially happening. And he said that, still some things going back and forth. Soon after that, Gary Russell Jr. talks with Bill Haney. Bill Haney sends over this term sheet or whatnot, but tells Gary Russell Jr. that there is no money to back this fight to happen. That the television networks and everything that could have locked down the fight to have it, it said it wasn't there, it wasn't possible. Now, this was around September 11th of this year, okay? Around that same time, there was articles posted that Devin Haney could possibly fight Gary Russell Jr. or Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, the date was November 7th, which was 8 weeks after they put up that article. It's on Boxing Scene. You can look it up. Actually, the conversation between Gary Russell Jr. and Bill Haney on September 11th is on YouTube. You can look it up. But they eventually, as you've seen, ended up fighting Yuriorkis Gamboa, which was no surprise to those that really followed it, because that was going to be their intent, to fight Yuriorkis Gamboa, you see, for their first defense of that WBC lightweight title. So they really didn't have any intent on trying to fight Gary Russell Jr. But Gary Russell Jr. still is saying, yo, I can move up to 135. So if you want to leave it open for me to fight there at 135 come 2021, why not? Let's make it happen. But the whole thing that went down as far as like the Haney camp trying to make a fight with Gary Russell Jr., we just went through a chronological order that they really didn't have that intent to fight Gary Russell Jr. because if they did, they would have sent out everything way before the fight date that was locked down November 7th. The television date on the zone, November 7th, was locked down. They knew it. But they didn't want to go forward and propose that offer towards Gary Russell Jr. They had something already set for Yuriorkis Gamboa. So, clarifying it one more time for folks, that you could have had Devin Haney versus Gary Russell Jr. on November 7th, but Haney's team didn't really want to go forward with it at that time. Gary Russell Jr. is like, yo, if you ain't got it, then you ain't got it. But if you want to revisit it, you better come correct, because I've been a professional for a long time, so I know how the game go. So if y'all gonna come at me with something, y'all gotta, really do what needs to be done. Especially when Gary Russell Jr. has already talked with Eddie Hearn on multiple occasions. So it's not like you could really try to pull a fast one on him. That's not gonna work. But that's what I have for this topic, man. Y'all go ahead and share your thoughts on what went down between Gary Russell Jr. and Devin Haney this year, and if a possible fight could happen between those two in 2021. Until next time, folks, I'm out. Peace.